Welcome, everyone, to AURI Connect's Fields of Innovation, part of AURI Connect's monthly online series featuring updates on the work that AURI is doing to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products and processes. I'm Dan Scogan, AURI's Director of Industry and Government Relations, and your host for Fields of Innovation. The AURI Connects program is hosted by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute in Minnesota. The AURI Connects Fields of Innovation platform is proud to present this virtual session, sponsored by Bremer Bank, to highlight the innovations and the market trends creating new opportunities, alfalfa production in Minnesota. And now this message from Bremer Bank.
Hello, and welcome to today's Field of Innovation webinar. I'm Melissa Carmichael, VP of Strategy and Innovation here at Bremer Bank. At Bremer, we are very proud to partner with AURI and other organizations that find innovative ways to do more. For generations, we have worked to cultivate thriving communities by being the trusted banking partner of farmers and agribusiness in our region. It is in part to this we are very proud to be the 9th largest ag lender in the U.S. So again, we would like to thank you for all that you do to increase the value of Minnesota's agricultural economy. We hope you enjoy today.
Funding for AURI's alfalfa research and this event have been provided by the Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. The Trust Fund is a permanent fund constitutionally established by the citizens of Minnesota to assist in the protection, conservation, preservation, and enhancement of the state's air, water, land, fish, wildlife, and other natural resources. Fields of Innovation, with sponsorship from Bremer Bank, is focused on bringing together Minnesota's regional ag and food value chains to build capacity and successfully commercialize new and emerging crops. Events focus on examining market opportunities for novel crops and highlighting new technologies or systems in existing crops. Remember that this event is being recorded and archived and can be found at auri.org. Also remember, participants are muted, but you can ask questions through the Q&A portal on your screen. Today, we are here to discuss new markets and opportunities for alfalfa production and to highlight project work that was funded by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. Alfalfa is the 4th most widely planted crop in the United States at over 16 million acres, with an estimated annual value of $11.7 billion. In addition to its economic value to farmers and the agricultural industry, alfalfa provides multiple benefits as a perennial crop, such as protecting water resources by reducing soil erosion and loss of nutrients from fields, reducing the need for pesticides and fertilizers, supporting pollinators, and improving soil health. The crop also produces high levels of crude protein per acre, providing a potentially valuable source of plant-based protein with a wide and growing array of potential high-value uses. Alfalfa's combination of economic and environmental benefits has sparked increased efforts to enhance its production, with researchers in Minnesota and beyond seeking to unlock the crop's potential by developing new high-value uses for this crop. To further explore market options for alfalfa, our panelists for today include Dan Wiersma, Chair of National Alfalfa and Forage Alliance, Dr. Nick Jordan, the University of Minnesota Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics, and co-director of Forever Green Initiative, and Deb Samick, USDA ARS research leader and adjunct professor. From AURI today, we will hear from Al Daring, senior scientist in co-products, Michael Sparby, commercialization director, and Dr. Michael Studelberg, our chemist. To start the conversation today, we would like to welcome the chair of the National Alfalfa and Forage Alliance, Dan Wiersma. Dan, welcome to Fields of Innovation.
Well, thank you, Dan. Appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak with you today and for discussing the new opportunities for alfalfa. We're always interested in exploring those. I did want to mention that the Midwest Forage Association is NAFA's largest affiliate and represents the interest of the alfalfa industry in the upper Midwest in particular, including Minnesota and the surrounding states. So certainly a strong alliance there. The NAFA organization is a group of farmers, of seed growers, breeders, seed marketers, and other allied industry partners who have joined together to be as advocates for the alfalfa and forage industry, addressing a number of key alfalfa issues. We work on some public policy and in particular public research funding efforts. We help issues around export markets, as well as insurance programs, and then also provide some education and training to alfalfa growers and those working in the alfalfa industry. As you mentioned earlier, alfalfa is a really important crop in the United States with an annual value of the hay produced as being at about 11.6 billion, ranking it number 4 in the country, just behind wheat. And if you look at those numbers on the map of the United States, the red number actually represents the alfalfa ranking among field crops within each state. So you can see most states have either a 1, 2, or 3 ranking. And so it really points out that alfalfa is important in the United States and important in a large number of states at a high level. We love talking about alfalfa and its sustainable characteristics, not only for our soils and our cows, but for the environment in general. We see alfalfa as having a great sustainability profile. When you compare alfalfa with corn, soybeans, and even cover crops that are grown between, we see that alfalfa provides a large number of ecosystem benefits. Things like carbon sequestration potential. It helps improve soil structure. It provides nitrogen to the growing crop as well as nitrogen to the subsequent crops. It's great in terms of reducing soil erosion and nutrient leaching, and finally increases our soil microbial diversity, enhancing soil health overall. So a great profile that really is a great fit for the agricultural landscape. So one of the things that NAFA has been involved with is an annual visit to Washington, D.C. to meet with congressional leaders and staff people to talk about alfalfa and bring to their attention the needs around alfalfa. We meet with the Congress people who are associated with the agricultural committees and so forth, as well as people from EPA and other parts of the government. In that process, one of the things we like to point out, as this slide shows, is that alfalfa is a really important crop from a just total dollar and cent standpoint contribution to U.S. agriculture, but it's really underfunded in terms of its support. For instance, in ARS funding at 8.8 million, as compared to the other major crops ranging anywhere from, the other big 4 being anywhere from $35 to $60 million of funding. Far fewer scientists devoted to alfalfa, and certainly by a large factor compared to some of our other crops in the country. So we like to point that out. And we like to talk about a number of priorities when we're on the Hill. Certainly the sustainable agriculture, we've raised that to the top of our list here, just talking about all of those ecosystem services that alfalfa can provide in the agricultural landscape. We talk about alfalfa's need for a safety net. It's not a commodity crop. It's not a program crop in terms of like corn and soybeans or wheat. And so rather than pursuing it as a program crop, we've said, let's invest in research. Let's enhance our insurance programs. Let's develop systems, for disaster assistance. And in doing that, we think we can provide a better safety net for alfalfa than what we have today. Part of our ask is around public research, asking for parity in funding for alfalfa and forage research through ARS and the NIFA programs. We do work with some of the government agencies on export market challenges, as well as our crop protection tools, working with the EPA to help support those. And that's really critical for our alfalfa seed growers who are faced with a number of unique insect challenges while growing the seed. So as you can see in this slide, when we look at some of the success we've had to date with our conversations in Washington, it's a good story. So first of all, if we look at the Alfalfa Seed and Forage Systems program, which is really what we often refer to as NIFA funding, we've over the last 9 years have nearly $22 million of additional funding devoted specifically to alfalfa and forage research. So great success story there. Among those priorities that are focused on in that program, certainly we want better alfalfa yield. We want to work on forage quality of alfalfa and other, for harvest and manage and storage systems. But as you see in the highlighted line there, one of the priorities is to explore new uses for alfalfa, such as in fish feeds or nutritive supplements and protein sources for humans. So very much in line with AURI's priorities, and we like to see that in our program. The other area that we've seen success in is in ARS funding, looking to increase funding another $1 million, specifically focused on alfalfa. And that is really about, again, putting it in a recurring budget. So it's not an annual ask, but it's there every year. And again, when you look at the priorities and focus there, developing new markets or new products is part of that priority list. The third area that we have research funding from is a unique checkoff program that Alfalfa initiated in 2017. In this program, the seed brands or seed marketers volunteer to collect $1 per unit of seeds sold and contribute that to NAFA, who organizes and distributes the monies to public researchers for research on alfalfa. And we do that through an annual call for proposals. And again, this is really farmer-directed priorities, which generally align with where the federal government priorities are as well. But one of those priorities, again, is new uses and new market development. All of these research programs, we have access in terms of a database at our website, the alfalfa.org website. If you go to the research page, you can see the programs. There's a searchable database there where you can see reports and so forth on the work that's been done over the last number of years. So I invite you to get to that website and explore that a bit. So again, thank you for inviting us to talk about alfalfa, and we certainly look forward to joining you all in unlocking alfalfa's potential by developing new high-value uses for this crop, because it's great for the environment and great for agriculture.
Thank you, Dan, for that presentation. And just a reminder to our participants today that your questions can be asked through our Q&A portal on your Zoom screen. So if you have questions, please put them in there, and we'll bring all our panelists back at the end of our panel discussion to try to answer some of those questions. Next, this morning, we talk with Dr. Nick Jordan, University of Minnesota Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics and co-director of Forever Green Initiative. Nick, welcome to Fields of Innovation.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be part of this whole event and to be following up on Dan's very informative comments. So what I'd like to highlight in my presentation is why we at the University of Minnesota and in the Forever Green Project are so enthusiastic about alfalfa as a way to meet many of the goals of what people are calling regenerative agriculture, which has to do with rebuilding soils and protecting water and providing climate solutions from agriculture. And the real challenge is to find a way to do this that is economically viable at a wide scale. And this is where alfalfa seems to us to be an extremely interesting crop. So let me take a minute and put this in context by discussing the concept of continuous living cover in agriculture. This is the goal of the Forever Green project at the University of Minnesota and our many partners. So the idea of this is simply to cover farmland with productive living crops for as much of the year and across as much of the farm landscape as is actually practical to do so. And it's not based on any one kind of cropping. There's a wide range of both annual and perennial, woody and non-woody crops that are relevant to this concept. But the general idea is to pick up on a lot of the themes that Dan has already put on the table, that we have the ability, by having productive crops across the landscape, growing as much of the year as we can, to enhance the basic productivity of our agriculture, and certainly to rebuild and regenerate soil, water, and wildlife, and also as a pathway to climate solutions from agriculture, as Dan also suggested. So the general idea of building continuous living cover, at least as we approach it in the Forever Green project, is to work with our current agriculture and to find opportunities that are well targeted in terms of time, what part of the year we're talking about, adding a new crop to a current cropping system, and also where in space, where are the opportunities that you can really efficiently boost production and conservation in agriculture by adding something to our current cropping systems. Say the corn and soybean cropping system that, of course, concentrates plant growth for 4 months in the warm season of the year. So the real question that faces those of us who are interested in trying to expand this idea of continuous living cover agriculture is, where and how can we do this in a way that is economically feasible? Where are economically viable opportunities available to us? We know that there's a lot of market demand for expanding what people are calling regenerative agriculture. So General Mills, Cargill articulating these things. Walmart has made a very large pledge to try to influence land use practices on 50 million acres, again around regenerative agriculture and finding climate solutions from agriculture. There is a coalition that AURI is integrally involved in, as is the University of Minnesota, called MBOLD, here based in Minnesota, all dedicated to these same goals. So there is market interest. So how can we meet that interest in a way that actually, how can we respond to this opportunity in a way that is actually workable for farmers and the agricultural value chain? So alfalfa is really interesting because it, as Dan has already prepared us to think about, there is a very interesting market-driven pathway towards this continuous living cover and regenerative agriculture that the world seems to want via alfalfa. So Dan has already provided a nice introduction to some of the basics of alfalfa, but some things are well worth saying twice. So forgive me if I do so. Alfalfa, unlike a number of other crops that can support continuous living covers, such as the perennial grain kernza that you may have heard of, is an ancient crop that, of course, we know a great deal about growing. And so it's a very well-established crop, and yet we need to keep working on it persistently, as Dan said. But it's got that going for it. It has enormous conservation benefits. These were also mentioned by Dan. I thought you would appreciate seeing a picture of that remarkable root system that alfalfa develops, which is very important to many of its conservation benefits. And really our whole theme and thesis today is new markets for kinds of new kinds of products that the world wants and needs that can come from alfalfa, building on the current base around dairy. And a particular opportunity that's of interest to us in the Forever Green Project is ways in which growing demand for new sources of plant protein, potentially as feeds for animal agriculture, but also for direct human consumption, and how alfalfa is very well poised to respond to that growing demand. So Dan also mentioned aquaculture feeds as one of those particular opportunities. And so protein concentrates that can be produced from alfalfa have already been shown to be viable as aquaculture feeds. And as we will hear quite a bit more about today, there are a bunch of other products that can come from alfalfa that society wants and needs, and which can help us really respond to the market demand for this kind of regenerative and climate smart agriculture. So let's think a little bit about what it takes to actually respond to these market demands, because that's not really a simple thing. So let's think about what it takes to scale up any crop. And so you can just insert alfalfa there instead of a CLC. That again, that means continuous living cover crop. So clearly you need a crop that produces commodities that the world wants and needs, and which also has the conservation benefits that we're talking about. So alfalfa does check that box pretty darn well, which is why we're so interested in it. However, you also need farms and also supply chains. After the farm gate, everything that is needed to get a product to an end use market, it's necessary to have those, and those need to be developed to some degree, particularly for these new uses that involve new ways of harvesting and processing alfalfa, for which infrastructure at this point largely doesn't exist. And then, of course, there must be profitable end-use markets for aquaculture feed or anything else that the world wants and needs from alfalfa. So in addition to those basics, the crop, the supply chain, the end-use markets, there's also a lot of things that we know are crucial to scaling up any new crop, or really any innovation in agriculture whatsoever. So there has to be the availability of finance, capital, in other words. There has to be supportive policy. Folks who are involved in different sectors of society need to be trusting of each other and willing to work together around common goals. And there has to be a strategy for scaling things up. And these are all things that they may sound like common sense, but they actually have to be deliberately mustered in a coordinated way if we want to scale up anything. And so meeting market demands, responding to market demands for the good things that alfalfa can produce does require a coordinated effort to round up all of these things, the capital, the policy, and so on and so forth. So these are the things that the Forever Green Project in our cooperative work, of course, no one group of folks can provide all these things by themselves, but these are the things that we work for. Now, a particular problem in all of this is the kind of chicken and egg aspect of it. So the markets for new high-value products from alfalfa that can really expand the amount of alfalfa we have across landscapes and provide all those good conservation benefits, the markets are not going to develop unless there's supply. So demand is not going to develop unless there's supply. And of course, farmers are not willing to grow something for which there's no demand. So the only real solution to that is to try to grow these markets and these supply chains together. And that's really the strategy that we are trying to take. in the Forever Green project for alfalfa as well as the other crops in our portfolio. A fundamental part of this is to try to create what we call crop clusters. And these are simply efforts to develop on a pilot scale the base of a supply chain. In other words, actual production of a crop on farm. So what we find is that it's very valuable to support a group of farmers in growing a new crop. Now, of course, alfalfa is not a new crop, but if we are producing alfalfa for some new kinds of products from that, it kind of is, because its management and harvesting and the immediate post-harvest processing and storage are new things. So what we do when we create one of these clusters is that, first of all, we can say, look, we have a bunch of folks across farm country who are figuring out how to grow this thing. That incentivizes the end use markets to explore and to do the due diligence they have to do to figure out, say, how valuable alfalfa would be for a sustainable aquaculture feed. It incentivizes investors. It helps manage that chicken and egg risk that you have to develop supply and demand together. And it certainly reveals key needs, the kinds of things that Dan mentioned, for ongoing development of the crop and production methods. So we have been piloting this in Minnesota and initially planned to work in a watershed in south central Minnesota called 7 Mile Creek. We wound up working in the project that we have going on alfalfa in an adjacent watershed. But the point was to develop a farmer-led watershed plan for targeting an increase in alfalfa in all sort of the right places in the landscape where it would grow best and provide the most conservation benefit. This is a plan for doing that in that 7 Mile Creek watershed that was produced by a group of farmers using some advanced tools that the University of Minnesota has developed for looking at a lot of scenarios about where to put alfalfa in, say, a watershed. And so I wanted to share just a little bit about our strategy for trying to build these supply chains and value chains for these new uses for alfalfa. And I'm going to leave it at that, Dan, and look forward to some conversation at the end.
Well, I appreciate that, Nick, and certainly left us with some good information and lots of things to think about as we get to the end of our presentation on Fields of Innovation today with some questions. I know Nan put it in the chat, but I would encourage you once again, if you have questions, and we're getting a few in, so we'll pick those up at the end of our presentations today, but you put those in your Q&A portal, and then we'll be able to ask our panelists some of those questions. We're going to move into, and Nick touched on it a little bit, Dr. Jordan, about some of the work that's being done to, expand alfalfa beyond feeding it to animals and find other value to alfalfa. And to learn more about AURI's work with alfalfa, we're going to turn things over to Dr. Michael Studelberg, who will be introducing our co-products senior scientist, Al Daring.
Thank you, Dan, and good morning, everyone. And I'm Michael Studelberg with AURI and the PI for the LCCMAR grant that we're working on with AURI's PI for the LCCMAR grant, working with Dr. Nick Jordan for over the last couple of years. Our focus as part of the collaboration was to develop innovations in post-harvest processing that will reduce risk and costs for alfalfa farmers by motivating increased alfalfa production and focusing on implementing advanced chopping and sealing mechanisms to reduce spoilage. So before I introduce AURI's presentation, I'll mention I'll be available at the end for further questions as part of the panel. And lastly, it is my pleasure to introduce AURI's Senior Scientist Co-Products, Al Daring, with a pre-recorded presentation on AURI's work to establish a diverse portfolio of high-value products from the entire alfalfa plant.
Welcome, everyone. It's my privilege to be able to share with you some of the research that we've been conducting over the last couple of years. And I'll back up here. Special thanks to Minnesota Environmental and Natural Resource Trust Fund, who helped support these efforts, and also the collaboration with the University of Minnesota. Where we've been spending a lot of our time was really looking into how can we add value to alfalfa. If you look around Minnesota's landscape, many of the producers have the opportunity, they have the equipment, and they're familiar with growing alfalfa, harvesting alfalfa. And what's interesting is alfalfa is naturally an ideal cover crop. So we want to touch on some of the activities we've been pursuing. And then lastly, where are the opportunities for industry as we move forward? So our goal here was, number one, alfalfa is naturally an ideal cover crop, as I had mentioned, yielding high levels of protein per acre annually when you compare to a lot of the other grains that are produced yearly. Secondly, we wanted to identify new uses for alfalfa and monogastric livestock, because this could expand market opportunities and profitability for producers. As we all know, alfalfa has been used for years in dairy diets that are a staple and in beef diets. If we could expand that market and create greater demand, that was our focus. So the AURI project activities that I want to share with you today, or that I'll cover, are the different steps that we investigated. Number one, we looked at harvest, storage, and handling methods, and we really shied away from dry alfalfa hay in those markets. We really looked at putting up high moisture haylage just because it eliminates a lot of the storage issues. The second thing we looked at was extraction and analysis of the alfalfa juice, and that is the picture you're seeing on the left of your screen. The third thing we did was we focused on spray dried alfalfa solubles. So once we have that juice extracted, how do we capture the greatest value from it? Fourth, we looked at methods of handling high moisture press cake. Obviously, after you extract the moisture from the haylage, you still have the press cake. So we'll share a little bit about that and some of the options. Then we took the alfalfa solubles, the spray dried ones, and we looked at how do they perform in nursery diets. We'll cover that. And then lastly, the producer and processor opportunities. So first, harvest, storage, and handling methods. So our focus was to review mechanisms specifically for ensiling to prevent humidity-related spoilage or leaching due to rain. So many of you listening today, if you've been involved with putting up alfalfa hay, you know the challenge is always, how do you get up dry hay? And can you find a stretch of 4 or 5 good days to put up dry hay? So thus our focus was on ensiling, where you could cut it one day and within 12 hours, 24 hours, and you know, in our case, less than 48 hours, either put it into a harvester, ensile it into haylage, or even make baleage out of it, which is becoming very popular and what we actually utilize for our trials. The second thing that we focused on was identify and develop new applications for alfalfa. Specifically, we focused on processes to provide alfalfa as a nutrient source to non-ruminants while focusing on antimicrobial nutritional content or anti-nutritional content. AURI is also investigating the opportunity to use pressed alfalfa juice as a foliar feeding for organic crop production. And I'll share a little bit about the nutrient content that we found in the alfalfa juice. And then why are we doing this? What is the goal? And it is to identify alfalfa processing and storage methods that can easily be adopted by producers and provide value-added opportunities for expanding the adoption of alfalfa production. By doing that, we keep alfalfa on the landscape as a natural cover crop. So this slide gives you an example of the materials that we're talking about or that we're working with. So in the top left corner of the screen, you'll see a picture of the alfalfa haylage. In this case, we call it baleage. Here is a large square bale that was put up under high moisture and then wrapped or ensiled so it could go through the fermentation process. This is just, we ran several trials with several different kinds of alfalfa, different types of varieties, but this gives you one idea of what we were working with. The middle screen shows you what that alfalfa press cake looks like. So after it goes through the dewatering press, you end up with the alfalfa press cake. What you will notice there, and I should have thrown a pen down or a dime or a quarter for reference, you do lose some of the effective fiber length. Many of those fibers, after it goes through the press, are crushed and shortened. And then down on the bottom, it's the photo I had shared earlier of the alfalfa press juice, or which I'll refer to as the solubles as we spray dry it and you concentrate those materials. So then the chart on the right, it really shows you what happens to the alfalfa through those different stages. So if you focus on the alfalfa baleage, the control, it started at 70% moisture. It had a crude protein content of 24.5%. Now you can look as we move over, after you press that alfalfa, you know, we did see some loss in crude protein of about 4%, but still you have, in this case, we started with 24.5. Now we're down to just shy of 21% crude protein. And you can see we had about a 12% reduction in moisture. So then where did that go? And then you look to your right at the alfalfa juice. Now this is fermented haylage, so post-fermentation. On a dry matter basis, it was a very concentrated 36.7% crude protein, a very soluble crude protein. And then you can look down at the mineral content that it also brought with it, the alfalfa juice. And I want to point out that the potassium number is not a typo. That alfalfa juice had 9% potassium, along with the other minerals that it's carrying. So how did we get it? How did we extract the alfalfa juice? So the alfalfa haylage was ensiled and allowed to ferment for a minimum of 60 days. The alfalfa hay was ensiled at a higher than normal moisture level to increase the juice volume that we could extract. We extracted the alfalfa juice using a mechanical screw press, which you'll see the two different screw presses that we utilized on the right of your screen. And then lastly, moisture and plant maturity at harvest may affect nutrient content in the juice. So I just want to point out the two different screw presses. We started out with the lower right picture, which worked very well. And then we actually purchased a smaller Vincent screw press for in the pilot lab, which was very efficient. So that's how we extracted the alfalfa juice. And then to give you an idea of the analysis of that juice again, I pulled up another example. As I said, we did a lot of different extractions and there is variability within that product. But in this case, if you look to the left, the moisture is right around 83%, 16% solids. The pH now, post-fermentation, was 5.95. And in this case, look at the crude protein. We're 28.5% crude protein versus the 36 you saw earlier on a dry matter basis. But also notice the water-soluble sugar content, 16.16%. So very nutrient dense, protein dense, energy dense. The alfalfa juice contains high levels of sugars and nutrients. And keep in mind too, we worked with ensiled alfalfa. We also did this work with fresh alfalfa, which you can do. And if you look at the photo on the lower right side of your screen, you can see the vibrant green, plus it's very microbial active. That is a picture of the fresh alfalfa coming off of the press. So AURI explored potential high-value uses in the animal feed and fertilizer sector as a foliar feeding. We'll touch briefly on them shortly. So to give you an idea of the nutrient and the amino acid content of the spray-dried alfalfa, that's what we did. We took the alfalfa juice, which we had extracted, and you can see a photo of that in the top right side of your screen. We sent that off for spray drying, and the bottom right photo gives you a picture of basically the beautiful product. It looked excellent after spray dried. But then looking at to your left of the screen, because of the high sugar content in the alfalfa juice, we had to use maltodextrin in the spray dryer to prevent the spray dried materials from sticking to the walls of the spray dryer. What we did do is we saw a reduction in crude protein, obviously, because we had to use a carrier. So we dropped the protein down to 19.58 versus 36% on the samples that we sent to them. But you'll see the moisture content after spray drying was at 4.47%. But also look at the sugar content. And this is skewed now because of the maltodextrin, but now we are up to basically 62% sugar on a dry matter basis. But going back, and here's why we did this trial, our goal was to really investigate using these spray-dried alfalfa solubles in nursery pig diets. Look at the lysine content, very good lysine content at 3.5% crude protein, and even the methionine at 0.76, along with the other amino acids there. So that, you know, great amino acid content, highly soluble, and we'll share later on here in the slides how it does in nursery swine diets. So then after you have the haylage, you run it through the dewatering press, you have your liquid. As you saw in the picture of the previous screen, you have the alfalfa cake. So it's still high moisture. It's still sitting at about 50 to 58% moisture. What we did is we conducted drying trials. The first drying trial, we kept the heat at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The second one, we bumped it up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and we sent a sample off for radio frequency drying. The goal of doing this was really to look at what happens to the crude protein in the remaining alfalfa cake. How does the drying characteristics perform, which will show. So what you'll notice before I get to the next screen showing you the results, the dewatering press really has an impact, a positive impact on drying time. And drying alfalfa at 200 degrees Fahrenheit is much more efficient than at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And what we learned is alfalfa cake drying studies conducted, there was no significant difference between the two drying temperatures evaluated, just the drying efficiency, how fast, and the percent insoluble crude protein and protein solubility did not change. Here's some of the results showing that data. So if you look at the chart to the left, we have our pressed alfalfa cake, which was a control. So we started at 49% moisture. We had 22.7% crude protein. Look at the insoluble crude protein and keep an eye on those numbers. For the control, the insoluble percentage of crude protein was 6.87, and the protein solubility was just over 52%. Then you can follow the following columns as you move to your right. The protein cake dried at 140 degrees, very similar crude protein. Protein insoluble crude protein actually went up, which I think is just, it's slight, it's insignificant, it's an analytical error. And protein solubility basically improved slightly or stayed the same at 54%. at 200 degrees, did not affect the crude protein. Insoluble crude protein was about the same, and same with the solubility. And we saw very like results with the radio frequency drying. So then, as you look to the chart to the right, you'll see how rapidly the press cake, after coming through a dewatering press, gives up its moisture. Within 5 minutes, we went from 50% moisture down to 11.3. So it very efficiently gives up moisture, and the drying time is rapid. So then, when we received back the spray-dried alfalfa solubles, we worked with the University of Minnesota Southern Research and Outreach Center located here in Waseca, Minnesota, to conduct the nursery swine trials. We worked with Dr. Sam Bedu and his students who led the trial work. And what we saw is spray-dried alfalfa could be equally effective in nursery swine diets as spray-dried plasma as a protein source. So one of the things that Dr. Bedu had shared is that there is some effort to move away from animal-based proteins to plant-based proteins. This study did exactly that, looking at can a portion of the spray-dried blood plasma, which is often used in nursery diets, be replaced with the alfalfa solubles. So a nursery growth performance feed trial to compare spray-dried alfalfa and spray-dried plasma is required to justify the replacement of the spray-dried plasma. That's exactly what we did. The results were very positive. We incorporated the spray-dried plasma into the diet at 0%, so that was your control on basically a corn, soybean meal based diet. We put it in at 2%, 4%, 6%, and 9%. Our focus was, rather than a growth trial, we focused primarily on digestibility, ileodigestibility. These studies have to be conducted before a growth trial first, so you can predict what percent of the crude protein is being digested by that animal and the projected energy that that animal is getting out of the alfalfa solubles. So like I said, very positive results. And what we had identified is the optimum level of spray-dried alfalfa solubles in a nursery diet is at 6% of the total diet. What limited this was you start going over 6%, basically the protein is so soluble and so concentrated, it can actually be detrimental to the pig performance. And the best way I can describe that is just think of how the Atkins diet works. That's how it was referred to me by Dr. Bedu. You started going over protein content that can be absorbed, and that excessive protein becomes basically an energy burner within that diet. So very favorable results. And what I want to share is that report is available to anyone who wants it. So feel free to reach out to us to have us send you that study or the report from the university. So how does this benefit alfalfa producers, and where are the opportunities for processors? Well, over the past couple of years, AURI has met with various alfalfa processing networks to identify commercial opportunities, and there is significant interest in new activities investigating opportunities for alfalfa, especially in the juice extraction because of several things. Number one, if we can identify a high value use for the spray dried solubles, obviously we need to do some cost analysis and economic feasibility. But first we wanted to see, is it even an opportunity? Interest exists for alfalfa soluble extraction for nursery pigs based on further economic feasibility, as I mentioned. But then the third thing is due to the high sugar and soluble nutrient content, we've had interest from organic production operations looking at using the alfalfa juice as a foliar feeding for the nitrogen that it brings with it and the very soluble mineral or nutrients that I had pointed out earlier, the phosphorus, the potassium, and some of the micronutrients. AURI is collaborating with industry to investigate potential to ferment the alfalfa sugars and possibly make a low carbon ethanol from them. And that goes back to that 16% sugar concentration level in the alfalfa solubles. And then the last thing, which makes this a success, is Minnesota producers have the knowledge and the equipment to expand alfalfa production as new markets develop. So lastly, I want to thank you for your participation and attention. Wish I was there to help answer questions, but I know AURI staff is there and they were all involved in these activities. Then lastly, again, funding for this project was provided by Minnesota Environment and Natural Resource Trust Fund through the LCCMR. So I want to thank them for their support. And as I had mentioned earlier, the reason we did this is alfalfa is naturally a cover crop if we can keep it on our landscape. Thanks to the University of Minnesota and their collaboration with this grant and with the swine trials, and then to my coworkers at AURI.
All right, thank you, Al, and a very informative presentation on some of the work that AURI obviously has been doing with alfalfa and alternative uses for those proteins. We're going to have our final panelists come in at this time. Reminder that questions are coming in through the Q&A portal on your Zoom call this morning. And if you'd like to ask a question, please submit it there. Also, we will be bringing all of our panelists back for Q&A when we get to the last presentation. So next on our panel today is someone who has a long history of work with alfalfa and also a long history of working with USDA ARS as a research leader and adjunct professor. Deborah Samick, welcome to Fields of Innovation.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And I was really happy to be invited to present some of our work today that we've been doing to develop new uses for alfalfa, as well as new traits for alfalfa. And this is a collaborative project between the University of Minnesota and USDA ARS, as well as we've been happy to be funded by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, as well as USDA NIFA. So our long-range goal of our project is to increase the amount of alfalfa and other perennials on the landscape and help farmers to increase their farm revenue. So a little bit of background on some of the work that we've done in alfalfa over the years. ARS has been involved in breeding alfalfa for novel traits and for novel uses. And one of those is that we developed an alfalfa that does not fix nitrogen. It's called ineffective, and we can use it in bioremediation of sites that have too much nitrogen in the soil, such as this site that you can see here where a train derailed. We've also been developing alfalfa with different types of root architectures, and we've developed an alfalfa that is strongly taprooted, that can be a very good companion for forage grasses in a mixed sward. And then we've also been developing alfalfa that has highly branched roots that can tolerate waterlogged soils much better, as well as be resistant to frost heaving in the winter. And then the product that I'll be talking about through the rest of my talk is this alfalfa that we developed for biomass or bioenergy that's non-lodging and has much heavier and thicker stems than a natural hay-type alfalfa. So there is a question in the chat about declining acres of alfalfa. And so one of the reasons that we're trying to develop new uses of alfalfa is to expand the use of alfalfa to help reverse this trend that started in about the 1980s. So what we're trying to do is demonstrate the economic value of alfalfa. And one of the ways we're doing that is to quantify the carbon credits that's available from growing alfalfa. And then also to develop new uses, potentially for animal uses, as well as for human food uses. So today I'll be talking about our work that we've been doing to develop alfalfa protein concentrate or alfalfa nutrient concentrate for aquaculture feeds. So ARS research in the 1980s and 90s showed that you could juice alfalfa, as Al described, and produce a protein concentrate that's high in lysine and high in xanthophylls that's very good for monogastric animals. And I also mentioned that we developed this biomass type alfalfa, and it has a really nice opportunity to be able to strip the protein-rich leaves from the alfalfa from the carbohydrate-rich stems using this special type of harvester. So why focus on aquaculture feeds? Well, as shown in this graph, aquaculture is the fastest growing food sector. And to meet this demand for fish and shellfish, it can't be met by natural harvests. And so more and more fish are being grown in containment in aquaculture. However, this aquaculture really faces a challenge in their feed components, in that a large portion of the feed is made up of fish meal and fish oil. And these sources, this fish meal and fish oil, are really not sustainably produced. And as well, the pricing of and the sources of this material is quite volatile. We've also found, a supplement that you can use instead of fish meal is soybean meal. But in many fish species, they do not tolerate a lot of the anti-nutritional factors that are found in soybean meal. Particularly the trout and salmon do not tolerate these anti-nutritional factors. So we've been, in our research, we've been actually using a commercial product called Vit Alpha that's produced in France. As far as I know, there's no US-based production facility for this protein concentrate. And what we found is that it is high in protein. It's also high in omega-3 and 6 fatty acids, as well as those high in xanthophylls that can increase skin and shell color. And currently, this French product the pricing is approximately similar to fish meal. So we had a project where we did some preliminary research on using this commercial product in feed for yellow perch. And we also looked at whether we could produce our own alfalfa protein concentrate and how the method would vary, how the product would vary by the method that we used in producing the protein concentrate. So we used our biomass alfalfa and stripped off the leaves and produced the protein concentrate from either leaves or total forage. And then we also did fish feeding studies with yellow perch. So what we found out was that indeed the way that we concentrated the protein out of the alfalfa juice did change the final product. If we used heating or acid or alkali, it changed the percentage of protein, the percentage of sugars and fats in the product. We were really excited to see that our biomass alfalfa could be used in this system very efficiently. And so from an acre of biomass alfalfa, we could produce 762 pounds of this alfalfa protein concentrate from alfalfa juice. We also got over 4,000 pounds of dry hay from an early spring harvest. And as Al mentioned, after you juice the alfalfa, you have a pressed cake residue. And so we had over 6,000 pounds of pressed residue. What we found was that we could produce 42% more of the protein concentrate using the biomass type alfalfa compared to a typical alfalfa that was harvested multiple times at an immature stage. We also found that replacing all of the fish meal in the diet for yellow perch was still very palatable to the fish, but it did slightly delay growth. This allowed us to get funding from USDA NIFA to do further studies to try to find out what's the optimal amount of APC, protein concentrate, in feed, and to see if it will be palatable by other fish species. And finally, to look at some of the cost of production. So this work is in collaboration with folks at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, who are looking at rainbow trout as well as yellow perch, and Matt Digman, who's doing our economic analysis at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So some of the things that they found by looking at the feed that has alfalfa protein concentrate is that as you increase the amount of the concentrate in the fish diet, the pellets actually become more durable. And so this is a good thing in handling and just durability of the pellets themselves. They also found that they became more dense as you added more of the alfalfa protein concentrate. And this is good for fish that actually feed from the bottom, such as carp, but less beneficial for species that like a floating feed pellet. Also looked at the effect of increasing amounts of the protein concentrate on palatability and digestibility. And we found that increasing up to 20% of the feed had no change in feed intake by rainbow trout. But in a feed study, we did see that up at 20% of the incorporation, there was a slightly decreased digestibility of the total dry matter. And even more important, even at 10% incorporation, we did see a decreased digestibility of the phosphorus in the feed. So these need to be addressed as we move forward in developing this as in aquaculture diets. They conducted a 9-week feeding trial with the rainbow trout and saw a weight gain, a reduction in weight gain as we increase the amount of APC in the diet. And this is probably because of that reduced digestibility of dry matter and phosphorus. However, there was no significant impact on fish morphology or on the composition of the fish fillets. So at this point, to sort of balance the protein needs and digestibility in rainbow trout, we're looking at about 12% incorporation in the diet for rainbow trout. And we're taking this now to commercial trout farms to see how this works on in a large scale fish operation. Last thing I'll mention is that we carried out a economic analysis of producing the protein concentrate. And so this is based on all of the equipment that's needed, actually purchasing the equipment, from harvesting it to hauling it to a macerator and screw press machine and producing the juice and press cake. And so it was estimated that you need about $10.74 for every kilogram of protein concentrate that's produced. So Matt and his students are also looking at the cost for a processing facility. So once you have the green juice and run it through a processing facility that coagulates it by heating and then spray drying, and looking at the costs involved in this production facility. So they're still working on this, and the costs are still preliminary, but we should have that data by the end of the summer. So, we're looking at, could we actually have a Minnesota processing facility? So here's our very simplistic way that we could look at biorefining alfalfa. If we're just interested in producing feed, we could produce this from the high protein leaves and make a feed that's both used for ruminant animals as well as monogastric animals such as fish. Use the stems for bioenergy. But as Al mentioned, there's a huge number of opportunities for further refining of the juice into a white protein concentrate that could be used for human foods and cosmetics, as well as using that juice or deproteinized juice as industrial feedstock for separation of enzymes, dyes, carbohydrates, as well as using it in fermentation for other products. So we see a really bright future for making multiple products out of alfalfa and increasing the value of the crop for the Minnesota farmers. So thanks again for this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Deborah, for that great presentation. And these presenters today have just piled on great information one after the other, and we appreciate that. Time to get to questions this morning, and if you would like to have yours answered, we certainly would welcome you to put it in our Q&A portal now, and then we will take a look at them, try to eliminate the sames and similars, and get some questions to our panelists today. Joining me for this portion of the webinar is AURI Director of Commercialization, Michael Sparby. And Michael, I'm going to start with you as someone who has firsthand knowledge of some of AURI's work around alfalfa, what has worked and what has not. Maybe look into our portfolio a little bit and just talk about, Al talked about a few things, but talk about what kinds of projects AURI has been involved with when it comes to alfalfa.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, as Al kind of mentioned, with this project, we have worked with engaging industry kind of on multiple levels. And that engagement included the egg processing industry, the livestock industry, obviously, as well as producers. And a couple of projects, active projects that were created out of that process. Al alluded to one was we have a collaboration project going with an ethanol plant right now, taking a look at the fermentation of fresh pressed alfalfa, and that would be to be utilized as a blend with the regular corn mash, not as a straight feedstock, obviously. But they're very interested in alternative not starches, but sugar sources for the production of ethanol. So that project is ongoing and active. And the second one is working with a organic producer in West Central Minnesota. And what we're going to be doing is taking a look at the techno-economic feasibility of fresh pressing alfalfa and utilizing that fresh pressed juice as a foliar feed. So what we found with the fresh pressed alfalfa is the nutrient profile within that juice is very similar to the emulsified fish that the producer is currently using as a nitrogen source as a foliar feed. So very exciting work going on there. And yeah, we look forward to seeing what the results are.
Very good. Ask Deborah and Dan and Nick to join us as well. We'll just start at the top of our questions here. Thank you, Michael. Saudi Arabia has invested heavily in alfalfa production in the southwest part of the United States. And as we know, that is struggling with climate change and is drying up to some degree. How do we attract foreign investment, or how do you think we attract foreign investment and export opportunities for producers here in the upper Midwest? What's the key there? And I'll leave that open to Dan. You want to start maybe, or you got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, there are several challenges in the Western United States, primarily around water, as you mentioned. So our ability to produce alfalfa with more limited water resources, we're going to have to work on that, both genetically as well as just overall management wise. In terms of the export market, we certainly have a strong market. I believe we're probably have exported more hay in the last year than perhaps ever, but it's been a very strong growing market for alfalfa. I think one of the challenges there has been around the adventitious presence of genetically modified traits within alfalfa. We do our best to manage that, but growers are very sensitive and buyers are very sensitive to that. So certainly that's one of the challenges. And then there is a strong seed export market to many parts of the world, the United States is supplying seed to places like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and, China and other parts of the world to help produce alfalfa hay in those regions. And I think, I think those are the areas we focus on from an export standpoint, and try to maintain the strength there and increase our abilities there. Just my perspective for now.
Deborah, I see you're nodding your head, but anything you would like to add to that comment?
Yeah, sure. Of course, what they're exporting is dry hay. And so, that's what they're used to growing in Saudi Arabia, and that's what they're exporting from the Southwest. And it's lighter to ship than if we were trying to ship baleage. But in our ability to grow, high quality dry hay in the Midwest can be limited just because of our weather. But I think there's some really huge opportunities if we are looking at processing alfalfa. If we have like this press cake that we could pelletize and use for shipping as a drier product, as well as looking at some alternative methods of drying alfalfa in the Midwest to preserve protein and quality, and using that for shipping, because we have a great port in Duluth, so it could go out of the port of Duluth as well.
Nick, anything to add to that when we talk about attracting investors who want to grow more alfalfa up here?
Well, yeah, the thing that I would want to highlight is that there's really an increasing flow of financial capital into things that are perceived to be quote unquote green investment opportunities, things that are seen as having benefits for environment and climate. And so in the Forever Green Project, we are trying to build relationships with folks that are key intermediaries in getting in touch with that source of investment capital. There's an enormous amount of capital that is out there, and the trick is to attract attention and to come up with decently de-risked funding opportunities. So that's the key.
Another question for all presenters. It says, how important do you think conditioning plays a part in the industry? And how do you think the OEM manufacturers are doing? Are they doing enough to improve or focus their equipment on this problem of getting quicker, drier, more palatable forage? Is there a gap there? Is there something lacking?
I'll just take a shot at it. A lot of that conditioning effort is around these sort of higher humidity environments like we have in Minnesota. And there, conditioning is a great tool to help speed up drying. What we've also done, and I think the manufacturers have done a good job of producing, equipment that does a good job of conditioning this crop. What we also are working on are other management techniques, such as when we cut the hay, we lay it out instead of in a tight windrow, we lay it out in a much broader pattern on the field so that it can dry quickly. And in silage operations, you can come in the next day and harvest. In haying, dry hay operations, certainly that would speed it up as well. So I think overall we have some strategies that complement the conditioning effort that's the equipment manufacturers are doing.
And Dan, while I've got your attention, I was just curious on the map that you showed during your presentation. Very little or no alfalfa growth in the southeastern part of the United States. Is that all weather related as well?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit misleading. As a pure crop, you don't see a lot of pure alfalfa, but you do see it in mixtures with a lot of the summer annuals or summer, the warm season grasses that are grown in that part of the country. And there is continued interest, and I think it's a growth opportunity for alfalfa in the southeastern United States. They're starting to Dr. Dennis Hancock with the USDA is from that region and has promoted it a lot, and Deb could certainly talk to that. But so I think, yeah, it's a growth opportunity, not really totally environment limited.
Deb, did you want to add anything to those comments?
No, but there certainly is increasing interest. They can grow high quality alfalfa in the Southeast, and two of the newest alfalfa breeders are in Georgia and Florida. So we'll see some new material from their programs specific to those areas.
During her presentation, Deborah addressed the fact that we are seeing fewer acres harvested in Minnesota and the upper Midwest. And we did have a question about what you thought is driving that drop and what can be done to change that trend. I think we heard Deborah's presentation, but Dan, does your organization or Nick, I know Nick's out there trying to convince producers to use alfalfa more in their cover crops and their continuous living crops. How do we change that trend?
Yeah, that's a great question we all wrestle with. What we've seen in these predominantly dairy areas is that the use of alfalfa in the diet has declined and being replaced with corn as silage. And so as farms consolidate and grow larger, they tend not to have enough acres, so they plant more corn silage because there's more tons per acre. And then also it's a single cutting or harvest per season as compared to maybe 4 cuttings with alfalfa. So it's just from a labor distribution standpoint and equipment standpoint, it pushes people towards corn silage. And I would say another factor is, as we think about the insurance aspect, we just don't have great production insurance for alfalfa. We have good seeding year insurance, getting the crop established, but not beyond that. And so that's an area we're working with in particular.
Nick, as you push forward with continuous living crops, what barriers do the producers tell you they're facing when it comes to alfalfa?
Well, I think Dan put his finger on the key issues very clearly. And we know that in the case of any innovative crop production system, the ability of growers to support each other in figuring out how to make it work in the particulars of any local situation is really valuable. So that's why that strategy of trying to organize these clusters of pilot supply chain operations are so important. And in other words, individual farms in isolation, even if they're getting some technical support from technical advice providers from university extension, et cetera, individual farms have a tough time with that. And the other point is that as we look to new uses, as I mentioned in my presentation, there are new forms of harvesting and immediate post-farm gate processing that are integrally connected to growing the crop, right? And so all of that has to be figured out as a kind of a system. And so that's what has to be done in a way that doesn't put all the risk on the farmers. And so that's what I meant when I mentioned de-risking investment opportunities that are going to attract capital for scaling up these new uses. So those are some of the key things that we think have to be done and which we're trying to do in the Forever Green business.
To all three of you, has there been any work trying to grow corn in a living alfalfa field? That's somebody who's thinking outside the box. Is that possible?
I don't think so. I don't think so in a way that is economically or, from a farming point of view, too viable.
Harvest around those corn stalks would be difficult, no doubt about that. Here's a question. It says for Al Deering, but we do have Dr. Studelberg and Mike Sparby still with us on the call. For the spray-dried protein solubles, how will that be different, better, or more profitable than protein from a soybean? Have we looked at that at all, Dr. Studelberg?
I know Al, good question, by the way. I know Al in his presentation did show the amino acid content of the spray-dried material. But in regards to more profitable or not, we did some initial calculations on the cost of the spray-dried alfalfa as a feed, but that was a couple years ago. So we would need to update that based off of current soybean meal prices. So we can get that information to you and just updating the current price with how profitable it would be or cost to do it.
Appreciate that. Here's one that Deb mentioned, carbon credits during her presentation. How will the environmental benefits of alfalfa production shape the economics for producers in the future? Deb, do you want to add a little meat to the bone there on your comment about carbon credits?
Yeah, I am not the person to address this, since it's a lot of interest in carbon credits and getting credit from soil capture of carbon. The numbers are still not very firm about any crop and how much can be sequestered. And so that is an area where we're trying to get hard numbers, and how that'll all work out in the future is I have no idea. So maybe Nick could address that a little bit more.
Nick, I'm guessing that comes up in regular conversations with your group.
Well, it certainly does, and I think Deb is completely correct in saying that the really knowing what the carbon benefit of the kind of cropping systems that we're talking about is not been quantified enough to really let those markets develop. But I think it's important to think about more other ways that the environmental benefits of alfalfa production at scale can be essentially monetized to support alfalfa production. And so we are now seeing, for example, cities that understand that they have an interest in managing water upstream from them, both in terms of their drinking water supplies and in terms of dealing with things like flood hazards for cities that are becoming an increasing concern. We are seeing cities, so Cedar Rapids in Iowa is an outstanding example of this, that are really trying to establish partnerships with agricultural watersheds upstream from them to provide financial support for doing things like putting perennial crops in the right places in watersheds. And since alfalfa has such potential to, essentially provide value in a farming operation anyway, for lots of reasons, then that kind of little nudge that the sort of local markets, if you will, that aren't for carbon, they're for water. But those kinds of markets can be very meaningful, and I think it's quite important to work on that particular way that the economics of alfalfa production can be enhanced.
Deb Samek?
Yeah, I'll just add in that if we could look at the total farm budget, and in putting alfalfa in the rotation where you can have enough nitrogen for 2 subsequent corn crops after alfalfa with the current price of nitrogen, that you reduce the use of herbicides. If you have herbicide resistant weeds, you can get rid of those weeds. You can reduce the amount of BT resistant corn rootworm. So there's a lot of benefits that could be added into the total farm budget with alfalfa.
We have a question from somebody who raises a lot of alfalfa, and he's wondering about these processing facilities that we talked about a little bit and the logistics of it. How much dry matter or how many acres would be needed to supply these alfalfa processing facilities on a viable scale? Have we done that research?
Well, let me speak to that for a minute. I don't know if we've done the research or not, but it's a heck of a good question. And this whole business, I mean, what the participant is really highlighting here, Mr. Luneman, is that we have to think about developing supply chains. We have to think in supply chain terms. So, okay, what is a cost-effective scale for a processing plant? And what is the alfalfa shed, if you will? How big does that have to be? And what kind of distances would be cost-effective to bring alfalfa into that processing plant? Those are the critical questions that have to be tackled if we're going to scale this up. So this is part of de-risking the whole concept so that it will attract investment and can really scale.
We have one more question, or two more actually, around human consumption. I'm going to kind of combine them. And then I'm going to, for our final question of the day, just let each of you give us the next big thing. What do you see coming that we should be aware of, that we are excited about, and that's going to move this whole alfalfa protein forward? But let's talk a little bit about human consumption. What possibilities exist to use alfalfa protein in a plant-based food product for human consumption? And then in addition, what is the PDCAAS or other indicator of protein quality for human consumption? So kind of two questions there. I don't know, Dr. Studelberg, you're nodding if you have answers to that, or?
Yeah, I can take a shot at answering that.
Very good.
So first off, we part of our work too, we collaborated as well with the Plant Protein Innovation Center at the University of Minnesota to actually look at human protein applications from alfalfa as well. So that work is ongoing, and I think in the near future there'll be some more data coming out about that as well, potentially with the PDCAs as well. So there is research looking into human applications for alfalfa protein.
Nick, Deborah, Dan, anything to add to human consumption? Okay, then let's wrap things up today with the next big thing. And Dan, I'll maybe start with you and your organization. What do you guys see? What are you hoping for?
Yeah, I think I would point to, because I work for a genetics company. We are certainly working with alfalfa in new ways than we have in the past. We have new tools from a biotech standpoint to understand the genes involved in various traits. And so if we want to modify protein, for instance, we have a tool that will allow us to do that in these plants and do it very efficiently and quickly. And so that, to me, that's the exciting area, is adapting some of these new biotech tools to our breeding systems. We've done it in corn and soybeans for many years. We now have access to that through for crops like alfalfa.
Nick Jordan, what are we hoping out of the University of Minnesota in the next few years?
Well, last year, the CEO of Cargill said that in their expectation, in 3 or 4 years, plant-based protein would be 10% of their business in terms of protein. And so I think that in players like Cargill, we have very enthusiastic and sincere partners in scaling up, plant protein opportunities like alfalfa. And so let's just get going.
Very good. And Deb Samick, you get the last word today.
Yeah, alfalfa, it's not just for dairy. Let's start using it in multiple ways and getting more alfalfa on the landscape and more dollars in the farmers' pockets.
I want to thank everyone for a great presentation today. Recording of the entire conversation is going to be available at auri.org. And that does conclude AURI Connect's Fields of Innovation for today, presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. AURI's mission is to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products and processes. Here's an invitation to join AURI on Fields of Innovation Facebook group for future postings of events and other interesting content. Thank you for participating today, and we hope you'll join us again at July 26th from 2 till 4 at Prairie Producers in Olivia for an in-person exploration of the current and future applications for industrial hemp in Minnesota. AURI seeks to further explore value chain developments by gathering hemp innovators, policymakers, industry stakeholders, and key partners to discuss the potential for transforming hemp into high-value products, especially for food and fiber. Remember to visit the Fields of Innovation Facebook page for more information on Fields of Innovation or any of the work that AURI is involved with. You can find it at auri.org.